My name is Elara Quinn. I believed in two things most: the work I did and the people I let in. The first kept me awake because it mattered, the second slept beside me and taught me how to be soft. For years, those two truths held me up like a pair of bookends: policy drafts, clean spreadsheets, late night edits on my laptop, and a man who kissed the curve of my smile like it belonged to him. His name was Gavin Ward. He was not an obvious villain. He was handsome in a balanced way, a mix of careful charm and steady ambition. He worked in partnerships at a tech nonprofit I consulted for, and he smelled like rain and coffee. We met at a rooftop fundraiser where the skyline leaned in like an audience. He said, "You think too precisely for someone who paints for fun," and it felt like a compliment because he'd actually read my grant proposal. We fell into each other with that rare, terrible ease of two people whose timing aligns. He was generous in ways that made me relax, picking up dinners, insisting I take his umbrella, introducing me to people who later became helpful colleagues. I trusted him with my passwords the way I trusted my neighbor with my spare key. It felt intimate and ordinary. He made practical acts feel like proofs of love. "Can you show me how you log into your server?" he asked once. Just in case something goes wrong. He asked for permission. I gave it because that's what people who love one another do. They take small risks. We were a public couple in our circles: dinners, panels, the odd podcast. People liked us. There was a familiarity to that applause that both comforted and blurred the edges between professional and private. I'll owe him this. Gavin could network the socks off a room and make it look like a concerted act of kindness. Where he shone, money followed. Where he unfolded, donors wrote checks. The first crack was not dramatic. It was an email flagged from procurement, a note about a delayed vendor payment. A grant earmarked for after-school tech workshops had an entry that said vendor, Harbor Fix Solutions, status, paid to account 0923 Meridian. I frowned. That vendor name wasn't in our list. I texted Joan in procurement. She replied, "We thought you authorized a redirect for the demo pilot." My heart practiced a small, odd beat of denial. I opened the ledger and noticed strings of small transfers, micro payments the kind people think won't be noticed. 23 deposits of $4,999, 95 each, nothing massive, a drip that made a leak into a different pool. I called Gavin. He answered with a voice that used to sound like home. "Everything okay?" I read him the line item over the phone. He hummed and replied, "We consolidated accounts last month for the pilot. I handled it to speed things up." He used "we." He seemed helpful. He promised to rectify the miscommunication and to instruct procurement to reconcile everything. I believed him because trust is stubborn and kind. The story changes because of a single choice: when someone you love can turn your small, domestic habits into a professional weapon. I had used the shortcut of leaving a sticky note on my monitor, password hint with the words Elara work. Stupid now and only foolish in its domesticity. Gavin had seen it once when I was juggling coffee and a laptop and offered to type to save me. He said half jokingly, "You are adorable in a chaotic way," and then typed it in. That tiny act became an open window. When the auditors arrived 2 weeks later, it was polite at first: "We're doing a routine review." Then they asked for login times, and the IT staff retrieved forensic logs. My username showed activity between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m. over a series of dates. API calls labeled manual allocation executed by EC. The bullet points in their report felt like small knives. The investigators asked me clinical questions. I gave them the truth. I didn't make those calls. The word "by" then had already left a shaped hollow in the room: suspicion. I remember going home and sitting on the edge of the sink with a cup of coffee gone cold and watching the city press the dark against the window. My phone vibrated with the curt messages: "HR would like to speak with you." A week later, the press release went out: "Employee under investigation for improper fund transfers." My name was a headline. Friends stopped texting. The familiar rhythm of life, coffee, email, the way my shoes clicked on marble evaporated into the whisper of people rearranging their lunch plans to avoid me. And Gavin, he gave statements like a man scripting his defense. He was a study in professional remorse. He appeared in our circles wary but composed. He told journalists he was appalled by the errors and that our organization would cooperate fully. On social media, he wrote thoughtful threads about accountability with the same calm that had once made donors sign checks. The narrative he curated painted a picture where there was a messy error and a steady man who was cleaning it up. The rapidity of his rise never landed on me the same way again. Those hands that had held me had become the hands that rewrote my life. Police officers escorted me to a small interrogation room one morning. They treated me politely enough, the way a technician might treat a malfunctioning machine. "We need to be thorough," they said. "You understand." I understood in the sharp way of someone who can imagine the end credits of a life: lost job, public disgrace, the slow evaporation of contacts. My mother called less. When she did call, she said, "If you need to come home." And I felt how my life had folded into the small geography of a few rooms. For a while I expected an implosion of tears. But grief took a different shape, quiet, cold, focused. I could have broken, I could have disappeared. I did neither. The thing that shifted was a vow I whispered in the dark. If the world will not help me find truth, I will find it myself. I cut my online presence. I left town with a small backpack, my laptop scrubbed, a bank card with a new billing address, and an appetite honed by dread. I took work that paid cash, tutoring part, time in the evenings, ghostwriting grant drafts on the side. My face was not readily searchable if one used the shadow name. I learned that anonymity was not a punishment, it was a tool, and I watched from the small periphery of the internet as Gavin's story spun its polished thread. He stood in panels and said the right things about stewardship. He smiled for cameras and his LinkedIn endorsements ballooned. People wrote op-eds: "When institutions fail, leaders must step up." The world loves a narrative in which the problem is managed. It loves the man who can point to the mild hemorrhage and say he closed the wound. But a pattern remained on the ledger: micro payments siphoned into companies with names that smelled like spice racks and golf clubs. Meridian Holdings, Crestline Ventures, a string of small accounts in jurisdictions that made names private. Each transfer had a signature block with a name that, if you pulled a thread, trembled to reveal a network. I learned to read that network like a second language. When you stare long enough at numbers, they eventually form sentences. The sentences told a story. Someone consolidated community project reserves and operational fees and moved them into shell accounts where they became private capital. The communities with empty supply closets were the narrative's final footnote. The donors bottom, lined and smiled during ribbon cuttings while the kids never saw the promised kits. I did not want sensationalism. I wanted repair. Revenge seemed hollow if it left the world unattended. So I planned not to humiliate. I planned to repair, to restore stolen funds, and to rewrite protections so that no other small organization could be turned into someone's personal portfolio. I recruited help quietly. A friend from grad school who ran a boutique cybersecurity shop owed me a favor. An ex-colleague in procurement who believed in me lent access to old reports. A freelance journalist, more curious than most, agreed to listen over coffee and to audit a few suspicious invoices without shouting my name publicly. They were my small, methodical army. We began with petty steps: confirm vendor addresses, check sub-account beneficiaries, verify shipments. Then the map grew. We traced the shell companies to a series of nominee directors with brass names and P.O. boxes, and finally to a property trust that held an unassuming condo downtown. The condo's property manager had pension accounts in the names of a holding company that led back to an investment vehicle Gavin had partnered with. Each thread wound back to his partner networks. When you are betrayed by someone you love, you get a peculiar clarity about people's patterns. Gavin loved to be present in the light. He loved to host dinners where ideas were spoken and checks were written on napkins. He loved being the storyteller. The trick then was to make him comfortable enough to make mistakes. So I fed the right people the right breadcrumbs. I let investigative journalists find one oddly worded clause. I made the community meetings louder. I taught volunteers how to ask for receipts and to photograph their supply rooms and the lone box of glue. I wrote a short, readable guide about how to read a donor report and gave it out at town halls. The small people's questions, when collected, became pressure. Donors hate uncertainty. Donors want to know their names will be carved into the right history. Months of accumulation passed. The press began to note incongruities. Meridian Holdings shows no active employees. One piece read, accounts show donations flowed through non-charitable channels. Gavin's comfortable smile frayed in ways the camera loves to capture. He tried to fight back with statements of contrition and private assurances to people who mattered. But the net of facts we had built was not subject to charm. I won't pretend it felt good in a way that made me giddy. There were nights I wanted to scream, and others I wanted to curl into the smallest ball and vanish. The work required solitude and a curious partnership with method, but slowly the legal system woke. An auditor issued a formal inquiry. The police executed a subpoena. Board members who once nodded and smiled now read spreadsheets like confessions. When the notices came in freezing certain accounts, issuing temporary injunctions, I sat alone in a cheap apartment and let the day's light spill across the floorboards. I felt something that was not triumph but relief. Not revenge yet, not at all. Relief because the system that had turned me into a villain had a hinge that could swing both ways. And in that hinge I learned something critical. When you want institutions to change, you must become less dramatic and more boring. The most effective heroism is paperwork. The most formidable weapon is the audit trail. There are 3 things you learn to love when the world has been cruel: slow certainty, the soft custodial acts of proof, and the math of reciprocity. I came to adore lithe spreadsheets like they were hymnals. I learned to watch the timestamps of transmissions, the way sailors watch the stars. I began by building the facts until the story was undeniable. The strategy had 2 prongs: institutional pressure and grassroots restoration. Each had its own pace. One wore suits and wrote reports. The other slapped flyers on telephone poles and taught volunteers to photograph boxes. First, institutional pressure. My journalist friend, Daniel, ran pieces with strict, non-accusatory language. Donations earmarked for community workshops show transfers to private accounts between 2019-2021. He quoted auditors. He published redacted copies of invoices that did not match shipment records. The tone was surgical. Readers reacted with anger and with very practical impulses. Donors asked for receipts the board called emergency sessions. Second, grassroots restoration. I taught a small group of volunteers how to check a payments trail. I showed them the annotation lines that say reserve, but mean reallocation. I taught them to photograph everything: invoices, delivery slips, empty storerooms. The first time a parent stood at a council meeting holding a photograph of an empty supply cupboard and asked, "Where are the paints you promised?" A ripple of accountability moved through the room that polished sentences do not create. It's hard to fake a parent holding a photograph of a child's empty desk. In the middle of it all, Gavin tried to salvage himself with an op-ed about rebuilding trust. The piece was polished and contained sensible language. He was good at that, controlling perception, but the chain of facts was heavier than he was. The auditors found emails where his team had instructed a junior staffer to route payments via Meridian for flexibility. The word flexibility is the favorite cloak of the corrupt. They think it sounds noble. In context, it sounded like the word when theater people say it's a creative solution. I filed formal complaints with evidence. I did not go out in the streets banging a drum. I let the legal trail yank him into the light. Subpoenas were issued. Auditors demanded bank reconciliations. Someone noticed a series of payments labeled consulting fees that, in the end, mapped to a few luxury purchases: a car lease, a condo, subscriptions to high-end services. The econometrics of moral failure is sometimes alarmingly mundane. The press followed the money like a river. The donors began to ask for returns. A few of his partners began quietly to distance themselves. There was a delicious, small cruelty in the way his calendar filled with interviews instead of fundraisers. These were the bruises of a man who learned that narrative cannot always rebuild a bank account. But I never confused ruin with redemption. I had no appetite for humiliating a human being to the bone. I wanted restitution and policy reform. I wanted the kids who had been promised kits to have kits. So I worked both to take the misappropriated funds back and to rebuild the mechanisms that would keep them secure. Rebuilding required legal restraint and public-facing policy frameworks. I drafted a simple public ledger template and shared it with small organizations across the city. A public ledger is practical and boring. It lists every donation, the intended use, receipts, and invoice numbers linked to photos uploads. Boring things are underrated. They make theft vastly more tedious to execute. When donors know a spending item will be published publicly, you cut down on games. At council meetings, I testified about the mechanics of theft, how small amounts aggregated into a giant problem. I did not perform myself into vengeance. I told facts, people listened. Some were astonished to learn how small, frequent payments could vanish into private accounts. Others were furious. Fury is a useful engine. Fury makes people vote. Throughout this time, I had an odd private education in legal strategy. My lawyer Caleb was the kind of man who had been a bureaucrat's nightmare, meticulous and patient. He taught me how to assemble a case so dense the accused could not rely on theater or charm. We filed for asset freezes, targeted audits, and an inquiry into procurement controls. The legal measures were procedural and cool, and, importantly, they worked within the system's language. I used the system to fix the system. When Gavin realized the evidence could not be smoothed away, he tried negotiations. He sent messages, "Let's talk, I can make it right." He would add small monetary offers to our mutual friends' cafe tabs, the kind that read like bribes disguised as kindness. He believed in relationships as currency. He had forgotten that currency is less persuasive when you have a stack of bank reconciliations proving the opposite. One day, in a public hearing packed with parents, donors, and the press, a veteran volunteer testified. We were promised materials and teachers, then months of silence followed. The invoices show payments, but no deliveries. We have photos of empty bags, and the kids still ask when art time is. The room crackled. The board did not have a good answer. They promised an independent audit. This was the hinge. Over the following months, the audit's findings circulated quietly at first, then in clear headlines: discrepancies, missing invoices, payments to shell companies. The board called for resignations. Some staff were fired. A few donors requested refunds. The law advanced. The offices where Gavin had once entertained donors with charm now became the setting of depositions and the slow, excruciating rebalancing of accounts. And still, in the background, I kept working to restore the programs themselves. We set up an emergency fund small, seated by donors who wanted to make amends to buy supplies immediately for the impacted children. The first shipment of crayons arrived on a rainy Monday, and the volunteers who had feared being laughed at by their neighborhoods started crying when they saw the boxes. One volunteer said, "You did this for us." And the way she looked at me was like someone who had watched you hold the line in a storm. That look is not revenge. It's the smell of a promise being kept. It took a year of slow pressure to make the biggest institutions move. There was no single moment of glorious collapse. There was instead a series of administrative victories, asset freezes, restitution orders, policy adoptions, each proving the utility of patience and paperwork. Gavin's reputation frayed. He sued first, then tried to settle for money. The settlement negotiations were public, painful, and ultimately fruitless for him. The court ordered partial restitution. The police filed charges. The city's procurement policies changed. I won't pretend the process didn't cost me. Friends were lost, romantic relationships stalled. A few nights had the ache of existential erosion. But I also saw children get markers. I saw the community adopt a ledger system that would make the siphoning of funds a riskier operation for any predator. And something remarkable started to happen. Other communities seeing us move began to adopt similar transparent practices. Black boxes gave way to public ledgers. Donors started asking for line item receipts rather than glossy photos. The language of accountability crept into the way communities talk. That mattered more than my personal vindication. When the final legal outcomes arrived, Gavin faced charges for embezzlement and fraud. He lost positions he'd built with charm and pretense. He had to answer to authorities and to the community whose trust he'd traded in. I saw him at a hearing one, solder in a way I used to like, but smaller. There is no joy in seeing a human break. There is only the austere satisfaction of truth aligning with consequence. After the legal dust settled, there was an odd in-between time. The city felt altered, like a room where the furniture had been rearranged. I returned to the office that once felt like a stage and sat in meetings that had new rules. The public ledger we designed became pilot policy in neighboring districts. The kids' art programs had supplies. People wrote op-eds analyzing what had happened. Some praised me as an architect of accountability. I felt oddly shy about the praise. I would rather be ensuring crayons were ordered. My personal life moved slowly. The man I dated after the ordeal, a quiet researcher named Matteo, taught me how to let anyone in carefully. He asked for passwords in a tone of protocol. "Can I have your emergency contacts?" Rather than "trust me." The difference was not small. He was not a salvo. He was a patient builder. People ask if I'm different. Yes and no. I am less naive and more stubborn. I preserve my identification keys like sacred items. I watch the way people like Gavin move. I do not let them into the quiet corners they once abused. I do not avenge, I secure. Most of my energy flows into making systems where power cannot hide in shadow. There are residual lonelinesses. I lost some friendships. Some acquaintances felt too awkward or perilous. You are told that the cost of truth is everything sometimes, and sometimes that's accurate. But the goodness returned is a different shape. It is the trust of the parents who once complained, the gratitude of a volunteer who knows there will be markers on Tuesday, the small boy who held up his painted dinosaur and said, "Miss L, look." That is the warmth that replaces a counterfeit intimacy. Once, months after everything, Gavin tried to speak to me in a stairwell. He looked like a man who had practiced humility in a mirror. He said, "I am sorry, Elara. I messed up." He seemed small in a way that did not feel like a victory to me. I listened, then I said, "You grew your shame well. It suits you." I walked away. Part of the point of accountability is that some things don't need to be dramatized. They simply require a recorded outcome and a community that watches budgets. I started to teach. I spoke at community centers about ledger literacy. In those talks, I explained, blandly and patiently, how to read an invoice and when to ask for a receipt. People came, and they brought their questions. What if someone refuses? What if they say they'll take care of it? When I answered, I didn't speak as a hero. I spoke as someone who had learned to translate grief into procedure. Months later, a mother from a small neighborhood emailed me. Our little community garden got saved because of the ledger template you shared. Her note came with photos, kids planting, a garden with painted stones saying we did it. I cried in the kitchen at that email, not because I was triumphant, but because the small thing we'd built, collective vigilance, was working. It felt like a soft, substantial victory. The legal aftermath left some money returned. Not everything. You rarely get everything back when systems are manipulated. But the money returned to the communities that needed it most, and the policy changes reduced the probability that some confident man could invent his own benevolence to steal the paint again. I tried to keep my life private after that, but not secret. Privacy and secrecy are different. I spent weekends hiking, reading dense books with no business in them, painting small canvases that I never uploaded to social media. I married the ritual of quiet. I also kept my voice for when it mattered. People sometimes ask what the difference is between revenge and justice. I answer that revenge wants to make a spectacle of ruin. Justice wants to put the pieces back properly. If I had to pick one word, I would say my work was restoration, not revenge. I stood to bring money home. I stood to keep kids in art classes. I stood to teach people how to read a spreadsheet. Those are mundane goals, and they are also religiously necessary. When I walk now through our city's community center, I see murals that once had been promised and never painted. I pick up a child's worksheet and see neat crayon marks. A woman who once refused to look at me in the lobby shakes my hand and says thank you in a voice that sounds like relief. Every so often, someone will bring me a small cake or a bar of soap as thanks. I accept and put it in the pantry for volunteers. The gratitude is small and non-spectacular, and it is exactly what I need. At night, sometimes I stare at the old sticky note I still keep in a drawer for memory's sake. Elara work. It's a small talisman of what can be humiliated and what can be hardened. I used to laugh at its mundanity. Now it feels like a warning and a map. If anything, the entire affair taught me that the quietest people can build the most precise storms that do not destroy for the pleasure of destruction, but storms that clear the air enough for seedlings to grow. My revenge was not a bonfire. It was a practiced, patient use of law, pressure, and civic education. It looked boring in committee meetings, heavy in audit documents, and slow in hearings. But it did what rage alone cannot. It made durable repairs. When someone asks me if I forgive Gavin, I answer like this: I do not wish harm, and I do not forget patterns. I have no savings for pity. I have ledgers, public portals, and a community that knows how to ask the right questions. That, I think, is the best kind of justice. My name is Elara Quinn. I lost a version of myself and returned with tools. The city is not perfect. No human fix is. But people have paint and papers now. Children draw, communities ask for receipts, and men who would count on soft loves to hide their schemes have fewer places to try their luck. That is the kind of revenge that matters to me, not to break a person, but to mend a city.